On the night of my 74th birthday, my children took me to dinner, and the evening was genuinely lovely. That I drove home feeling worse than I had in the months after my husband died. That I had no idea why. That I had been a pediatric nurse for 34 years. That I had watched people navigate the worst things a body can do. That I thought I knew which years were going to be hard, that I was completely wrong about which ones were coming. On the night of my 74th birthday, my children took me to dinner at the restaurant I had been going to for 20 years, and the evening was genuinely lovely, and I drove home afterward with a feeling that was worse than anything I had felt in the months after my husband died. That I don't mean that dramatically, I mean it precisely. The grief after Richard died was enormous, and it had a shape, and the shape was recognizable. I knew what it was and where it came from, and I could carry it the way you carry something heavy when you know what you're carrying. What I drove home with on my birthday was different. It was heavy in a way that had no name and no address, and it sat in the car with me the whole way and came inside when I did. And I set my purse down and stood in the kitchen for a while and then went to bed. And I did not tell my children, and I did not know what I would have said if I had. Dot. I had been a pediatric nurse for 34 years. I had watched people navigate the worst things a body can do. I had held hands through diagnoses, through deterioration, through the specific way a person's face changes in the last hours. I knew about hard years. I thought I knew which ones were coming. I was wrong about which ones were coming. What I had prepared for was the physical, the aches that arrive and don't leave, the medications that multiply, the body that starts to require more management than it used to, that stops being transparent and becomes something you have to negotiate with every day. I had seen this in patients for 3 decades, and I had watched my parents go through it. And I had thought, in the way you think about things that haven't happened yet, I know what this looks like. I'll know how to handle it when it gets here. It got here. The knee replacement at 72, the blood pressure medication that took 4 tries to find the right dose, the exhaustion that comes earlier in the evening than it used to and is more total than tiredness and requires actual recovery rather than a night's sleep. All of it arrived and I handled it because I had prepared for it, because I had seen it and named it and had a category for it. What I had not prepared for was the thing that arrived at 74 on the way home from a birthday dinner with people who loved me. The thing that was worse than the knee replacement and worse than the medication and worse than the exhaustion, and that I had no name for and no category for and therefore no tools for. I have to tell you about the planner. I kept a patient planner for most of my working life, the kind with 5-year sections in the back, where you could sketch out where you expected to be, what you expected to be doing, what you were aiming toward. I kept using them in retirement out of habit. In 2019, going through a drawer, I found one I had bought 2 years earlier. I opened to the 5-year section. The current year was partially filled. The next 4 years were blank. I had not made a deliberate decision to leave them blank. I had simply not had anything to put there. Not because I was unwell, not because I was incapacitated, because there was nothing I was aimed at, nothing I was in the process of becoming, nothing that the future held that I was moving toward. I was in the present, maintaining it, getting through the weeks, and the 5-year section had nothing in it because I had stopped having a 5-year section. I stood in the kitchen with that planner for a long time. Then I put it back in the drawer. That blank page was the most frightening thing I had encountered in years, and I had no idea why. and I closed the drawer and went and made dinner and did not think about it again for another 2 years, which is to say I thought about it every day and refused to look at it directly. Sylvia Park retired from the hospital the same year I did. We had worked alongside each other for 20 years, and we understood each other in the specific, efficient way of people who have shared decades of difficult work, without much ceremony, without needing to explain the reference. When her husband died 3 years before Richard, Sylvia did something I watched and found, at the time, slightly excessive. She went to a therapist and told the therapist, very specifically, that she was grieving the future, not the years she had had, but the years ahead, the shape of the life she had expected, and that was no longer the shape it would be. She said she was mourning something that hadn't happened yet, and the therapist had said, yes, that's a real grief. It has a name. Let's work with it. I thought this was a peculiar framing. I thought grief was for what was lost, not for what hadn't arrived yet. I was a nurse. I was practical. I believed in naming things correctly, and Sylvia's thing didn't seem correctly named to me. I have revised that view substantially. Sylvia also made a deliberate decision at 74 to begin something new, not a hobby, something with stakes, something that could fail, something that required her to be a beginner in a way she hadn't been in 40 years. She started training as a docent at the art museum. She knew nothing about art. That was the point. I watched her do these things, and I understood them intellectually, and I did not follow her example, because I did not yet understand what I was dealing with. The first thing that broke me was not grief, and not loneliness, and not any of the physical things I had prepared for. It was the loss of forward motion, the fact. I woke up one morning in the spring of 2020, 3 years after Richard died, 2 years after I retired, and I understood, in a very specific and quiet way, that I was no longer in the process of becoming anything. I was not going anywhere. I was not working toward anything. The life I was living was the life I would continue to live, maintained and managed until it ended. And I was 76 years old, and I had perhaps 20 years left, and I did not know what they were for. The interior. I told myself this was acceptance, that this was what maturity looked like, the release of ambition and striving, the capacity to simply be present in the life you have without needing it to be aimed at something more. I had watched people fight this recognition their whole lives, and I had thought the fighting was the problem. And now that I was on the other side of it, I found that the surrender had a cost I had not anticipated. Because it turned out that forward motion was not ambition. It was a different thing, quieter and more basic, more like oxygen than achievement. The sense that the story was still happening, that I was still a person to whom things were occurring, rather than a person who was waiting for the story to end. The detail I cannot shake. I can tell you what the light was like in my bedroom that morning. April, early. The specific pale light of a Portland spring that comes in low and gray and is not yet committed to being day. I lay in the bed that was too big, and I listened to the street outside, which was already moving, and I thought, I have nowhere to be. And the thought was true. And the truth of it was not peaceful. It was the specific terror of a person who has stopped being aimed at anything and has not yet found a reason to get up that is not just maintenance. The second thing that broke me was the loneliness of being loved but unseen. My children are good people. I want to say this without ambiguity. They call, they visit, they bring the grandchildren. They notice when I seem tired, and they ask if I need anything, and they mean it. They love me with a consistency and generosity that I do not take for granted. And none of it reached the specific place that needed reaching. what I needed and what I could not have named in 2019 or 2020, and what took me years to understand, was to be seen in the way I had been seen when I was functioning in my full capacity, when I was the person people came to with serious problems, when my knowledge and judgment and presence mattered in a way that was not personal but was real and consequential. I needed to be seen as a person who was still in the process of something, still becoming, still contributing in a way that required the specific things I had to offer, rather than just love and maintenance. What I got was love and maintenance, and I am not ungrateful for it. But love and maintenance are not the same as being known. And being known in that particular way, and I had not understood how much of my sense of myself had depended on the people who needed what I specifically had. The patient planner in the drawer, the blank 5-year section, the form at the doctor's office in 2019. I remember this specifically, a form about future plans and goals. And I sat with the pen over the blank line for a very long time. And then I wrote nothing. And I folded the form and handed it back. And the receptionist took it without looking at it. And I carried the blank line home with me, like a small, heavy object that had no name. The third thing that broke me was the collapse of the identity I had been building for 50 years. I had been a nurse for 34 years, and a nurse's wife for 41, and a mother for 39, and a colleague and a community member, and a competent person who knew a great deal and was consulted about it, and who had a function in the world that was specific to her and irreplaceable in the way that people who are very good at something are irreplaceable. All of that had a name. All of that added up to someone recognizable, recognizable to others, and recognizable to myself. And then it was gone. Not gradually. I understand now that it happened faster than I realized. The retirement, the death, the loss of the structure that had been doing the work of identity for decades. And what remained was me, without the roles. And the me without the roles was a person I had not spent much time with and was not sure I knew. The cost I had not anticipated was this. I had no idea who I was outside of what I did. I had spent 50 years building a self out of function, and I had not noticed that the self and the function had become the same thing. And when the function ended, the self went with it, and I was left with something I did not have a name for. Sylvia, by this point, had been working at the museum for 2 years. She was a beginner again, genuinely bad at something, genuinely learning, genuinely in the process of becoming someone new. She told me once that the curator she worked under had said something she found useful. You don't know enough yet to know how much you're going to know. She said it changed her relationship to the not knowing, made it feel like a beginning rather than a loss. I sat with that for a long time. In the winter of 2022, I was on the phone with Sylvia and I described, for the first time out loud, what I have been carrying for 4 years. I described the birthday drive home, the planner in the drawer, the blank line at the doctor's office, the mornings with the pale light that I had filled, one by one, with maintenance and management and the careful avoidance of looking directly at what was wrong. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's grief for the future. I had it too. It has a name." I sat on my couch after the call ended and held the phone and thought about what it had cost me to carry something for 4 years that had a name I hadn't known. Because if I had known the name in 2018, if someone had said to me, as Sylvia's therapist had said to her, "This is a real grief. It has a shape. It can be navigated," I would have known what I was dealing with. And knowing what you're dealing with is most of the battle. The rest of it is just doing the work. I had been a nurse for 34 years. I knew the difference between an undiagnosed condition and a diagnosed one. Diagnosis doesn't fix anything, but it tells you what you're treating, and what you're treating determines what you do, and what you do determines whether anything changes. For 4 years, I had been treating the wrong thing. I had been treating the loneliness as a social problem, and the loss of identity as a mood, and the grief for the future as ingratitude. And none of those treatments worked because none of them were right. Here is what I want to tell you. And I want to tell it plainly because I spent 4 years without it, and I have no interest in softening it. The hardest years of getting old are not the ones you think. They are not the year you lose the person you built your life with, though that year is genuinely terrible. They are not the year the body starts to require management, though that adjustment is real and ongoing. Those years are hard, and they come with a shape you can recognize, and the shape gives you something to push against. The hardest years are the quiet ones, the ones where nothing in particular is wrong and everything is maintained, and you are surrounded by people who love you, and you drive home from your own birthday dinner feeling worse than you felt in the weeks after your husband died, and you have no idea why, and no one gave you a name for it, because no one talks about this particular grief. The grief for the future, the loss of forward motion, the collapse of the identity you built over 50 years when the roles that built it are no longer there. These are the years no one prepares you for. These are the ones that will surprise you if you let them. And the surprise is the expensive part. If you are somewhere in your 60s right now reading this or listening to it, I want to give you the thing I didn't have. The thing that will be hardest is not your body. It is the moment, and it will come in some form for most of you, when you realize that the life you have been building is built, that the story you have been telling about yourself has reached a certain kind of ending, and that the self you know is attached to roles that are going to change or end. That moment is a grief. It has a name. It is allowed to hurt. It does not require you to be grateful for what you have in order to grieve what is changing. Find a person you can say this to, a therapist who understands this specific territory, a friend who has been through it, anyone who will receive the grief for what it is rather than reframing it as perspective. The naming matters. The grief named is a grief you can navigate. The grief unnamed is a grief you carry for years without knowing what you're carrying or why it's so heavy. And find one thing to begin, not a hobby, something with stakes, something that requires you to be genuinely bad at it before you can be good, something that puts you back in the position of becoming rather than maintaining. It does not have to be large. It has to be real. Tell me in the comments, is there something you've been carrying that you haven't been able to name yet? Because I carried it for 4 years before someone gave me the word for it. And I need you to know the word costs nothing and changes everything.